some of the lessons that we learned from our weekly Parashah, and then we'll look at a couple from the handout for Shabbat Hagadol. I'm not trained as a sociologist. I like to observe society. In my observations, at least in our American culture and society, and I think this is somewhat pervasive throughout the world, we have increasingly come into an era where let me put it this way, it's less and less proper to have standards. Would you agree with that? I think it was well illustrated by what Joshua shared, Nunez, when someone in his class was a bit taken back that anyone would take a poor innocent lamb and slaughter it to eat. I recently saw this bumper sticker again. Is meat really murder? It's very interesting that at the founding fathers of our nation, we're not going to get into the debate about what they believed and how they believed it and so forth and so on. But they did consider, at least to a certain extent, the Bible to be a foundation for how they wanted to form this democratic, or this republic would be a better way of saying it. And our own jurisprudence with regard to first degree, second degree, and third degree murder is taken right out of our text. Is it premeditated? Is there a lethal weapon? So forth and so on. Makes a difference between whether it's judged one way or the other. But in our text, there seems to be a contradiction. You know, the King James Version mistranslated it said, "You shall not kill." That's not what the text says. It says, "You shall not murder." But what about someone who did murder, and it's clear? And by the way, in our text it says the congregation. It is the word for congregation, edut, but it undoubtedly means the congregation of the judges. It wasn't put to the whole congregation of Israel, some 1.5 million people, to decide who was a murderer and who wasn't. So it meant the group of the congregation, the assembly. It could just as well be translated, of judges. If the judges in 2 or 3 witnesses, with 2 or more witnesses, declared that this person was a murderer, what was to be done to him or to her? Capital punishment. Our society would like to do away with capital punishment entirely. Even in recent days, and I don't plan to talk about politics on Shabbat, and there are certain politicians we won't name as well. The funding for justice system in the area of incarcerating people who are clearly guilty, the funding has been diminished and diminished and diminished. More and more prisons are overcrowded to the point where they're saying, we're not going to prosecute certain crimes anymore because we don't have the facilities to do so. This is the demise of a society. When those who have it in their mind and in their heart and in their intent to take the life of another unjustly remain in the society. God knows best. He made us. And some might say, well, capital punishment is inhumane. What is inhumane is the taking of an innocent life. And that begins with abortion. And it goes all the way into crime. And we have been riddled with it in our country here in the past month and a half or 2. And every time you turn the radio on, it seems like, I don't listen to the radio very often, but I do when I get into the car, and I usually put it on a news station, And it seems like every time I turn the radio on, it's talking about murders of innocent people. Now, you might say no one's innocent. What I mean by that is they're not guilty by way of what the Torah says to receive capital punishment. I don't even know what the statistic is. I should have looked it up before today. How many states have outlawed capital punishment? There's numbers of states that have. I think it's becoming the majority. I'm not sure. Washington just did, yes. We can count on it. When a society moves away, whether or not they acknowledge God, whether or not they acknowledge the God of the Bible, if the biblical record has formed the basis for justice in any society, when that society moves away from those standards of justice, it continues to move towards more and more trouble. So what are we to do? Am I trying to get a politically active campaign going here? That's not my goal. Although I think we have every right as citizens of this country to make our voice known and to do what we can within the law to allow righteousness to reign. And I think when we are remiss of that, we are remiss. And yet, we are living in a society which it appears could move more and more towards persecuting those who hold to a biblical standard. So my question is, are we ready for that? The test of our faith. When I was working at Kaiser Aluminum years ago, I don't even want to think how many, they had stringent tests for the aluminum that we produced. They had tests to see how pure it was. The area I was working in, the minimum was a 96% pure aluminum. It was being sold to NASA, and so NASA wanted aluminum that was without flaw. But there were also stress tests upon the aluminum. Have you ever watched a stress test on metal? That's pretty amazing. You have these hydraulic things, they put a bar in there and then it grabs onto them or is bolted to them, and then they begin pulling apart with hydraulic pressure that goes, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of pounds eventually, until it breaks. Sometimes do you feel that you're in that kind of situation? Well, as I've said previously, the words of a mechanic are true. Yeah. Yes. Is there a different word for kill and murder? Yes. Yes. Kill is related to the word for death, and murder is a different root. That's all. Well, I know the King James Version, no, there's different words. King James Version, in its translation, you shall not kill. To be honest with you, in early Elizabethan English, to kill had the sense of murder. Slaughter had kill. So you didn't kill an animal, you slaughtered it. You know, if you killed an animal by shooting it just out of fun, that would be killing. I'm not sure how strict they use those two terms, but slaughter was more the term for preparing animals for food. Yeah. Pardon me? Yes. Oh, absolutely. Genesis 9:6 is clearly that one who takes a person's life, his life shall be taken. And in the context, it means taken an innocent life. So the cities of refuge tell us that God is a God of justice. Isn't it interesting? We get this reoccurring theme of the cities of refuge, and just at the time that we're coming into our land. Finally, we're home. Finally, things are going to be right. Oh, really? Then why does there have to be cities of refuge if everything's right? Because we live in a fallen world. We live in a world that is, in some cases, dominated by sinful mankind. And yet, in the midst of this, God requires justice. There's a lesson to be learned in this. The lesson is that we must hold clearly to the statutes that God has given us in our personal lives, in our corporate life, and we must pray and hope that by God's grace they will remain to a great extent in our own society. Now, what about this? What about this avenger of blood? The term avenger of blood in the Hebrew is actually redeemer of blood. It's the same word that we oftentimes goel. Goel is the redeemer. It's the same word that's used for the kinsman redeemer. It's the same word that's used throughout the scriptures of our redeemer. Gaal Israel, the redeemer of Israel. What does it mean to redeem? We see that the basic sense of this verb is to restore the status quo. In the case of the kinsman, if you're wondering where I'm on page 5, in the case of the kinsman redeemer and the redeemer of the slave, the status quo of rightly inherited property is the result. In the case of the redeemer of blood, the next of kin, the brother, the father's brother, son of the father's brother, acts as the state's executioner and thus restores the equilibrium to the land. Isn't it interesting how often in our text it says that these kinds of sins, murder, pollutes the land? How do we understand that? Well, we have a good illustration of that right here in our own state. According to our lawmakers, they decided that they were not going to uphold the laws when people lived in places that were illegal. You know, like under viaducts on I-5, so forth and so on, right? It's against the law to live there. And yet the homeless have made that their refuge, or if you want, their jungle. And what did the lawmakers decide recently? Well, not so recently, a year ago or so. They were not going to prosecute anyone who did that. And they haven't. And what has been the result of it? How did it grow? I heard an interview by someone on the radio. They went and interviewed people that were living in those areas, and they asked, how long have you lived in Washington? They said, oh, I just moved here. Why? Why did you move here? Because they let us live here the way we want to live. It's just an illustration. When the law is set aside, lawbreakers abound. So if you have a land of Israel that allows murderers to live, and there are other regions, neighboring regions, that still hold to a death penalty for murderers, where do you suppose those murderers are going to flee? Right to the land. That's why it says you pollute the land. You make this place a place for the refuge of those who are lawbreakers. Yeah, it's a physical pollution. And this is one of the reasons that Israel is exiled out of the land. Because Israel failed to maintain and uphold the laws of God. Yeah. The blood of Abel cries out to me from the ground, the land. Yes. Isn't it interesting that the same number of cities were appointed on the east of the Jordan as were apportioned for the whole land on the west? This seems disproportionate, for the same number of cities is given to 2.5 tribes on the east of the Jordan as for the 9.5 tribes on the land. Rashi, who always comes up with very interesting suggestions, suggests that killing was far more common in the Transjordan, so that despite its smaller population, it required more places of refuge. Maimonides, Rambam, suggests that the geographic area was as large as the land and thus required the same number of cities. I would suggest that this apparent disproportion of allotment is not really a disproportionate in view of the value of one innocent life. In Hashem's eyes, the preservation of life and the enactment of justice is the important thing, and justice is just as much served in the preservation of one innocent life as it is in the punishment of the murderer. Do you understand what I'm saying? The cities of refuge, what is the justice there? For an innocent life. Someone who, through no desire of his own or her own, or by pure accident, took the life of another person. Think of it today. Let's say you're in a car accident and it was not your fault. Somebody pulled out right in front of you. We had this happen years ago. Someone pulled out right in front of us as we were on a main thoroughfare. Just pulled right out. Well, we could have killed somebody in that car. What would we have had to do if that had happened? God forbid. We would have found a city of refuge and gone there quickly. And that means that we would have been seen to be innocent, had there been enough witnesses, and our life would have been preserved. If we were guilty, we were thrown out of the city and left for the judgment of the one who could take our life. Pesach, what does it mean? It means to limp or to hop. I didn't hear that, but I'm sure it was good. Mephibosheth, you know, that whole story where the baby was dropped and he limped. That's the word Pesach. There's a couple of other places in the scriptures where it says that when a bird comes and hovers and between two branches, it's the same word there. To flutter back and forth between two branches. Now, why does a bird come in and shake her wings over the nest and go back and forth? To protect. It doesn't mean that to pass over doesn't mean to skip by. It doesn't mean to, okay, take the firstborn of that house, skip that house, pass over that house, go. No, that's not what it means. It means to protect. It's used as a metaphor of protection. And God says, I will protect your house so that the avenger. Wait a minute. Who's the avenger? So there's this metaphor. And this coming Friday, we'll do our Passover Seders at our homes and with our friends and so forth, right? And in the traditional Haggadah, it says, it wasn't an angel. And it goes down through a list. It wasn't this, it wasn't that, but it was God Himself who passed through. Because it says in the text, I myself will go and take the firstborn. Okay? So remember, when we celebrate Pesach, we're celebrating that God has protected us from His wrath. And He's done so through His Son Yeshua. Now, why leaven? What's wrong with leaven? Frankly, I think leaven tastes pretty good, don't you? Yeah. I mean, you know, we're used to that wonderful challah each Friday night, and we just feast on it. And now, next Friday, we get matzah. Now, there's things you can do to matzah to make it taste good. But let's talk about this. Is leaven a sign of sin? It is later on. Leaven is the idea of pride. To be puffed up, right? But in the Passover story, leaven relates to what? It relates to being willing to obey God at a moment's notice. Being fully willing to obey God. He says, now it's time, up and out. And what does Mrs. Goldstein say? Well, wait a minute, the bread hasn't risen yet. I still got it in the kneading bowl. Remember, what would they do? They would take some from the last batch, right? And they would keep it, and then they would put it in the dough, and then it would have to warm up in the sun or somewhere, and then, or near a fire, and it would take time. So the idea of eating matzah, eating unleavened bread, was to say, I was willing to leave as God said, even if it meant I couldn't have something I really enjoy. Pardon me? Yeah. The opposite is, Lot's wife, Just let me stay. Now, do you think, no, wait a minute, didn't they want to leave Egypt? They didn't want to leave what they were used to, and some people probably had some pretty heavy attachments there. Do you think that there were some who married Egyptians? We know that there was a mixed multitude that came out of Egypt, right? You've got family ties, so forth and so on. Do you suppose there were those who grew up in 430 years, actually probably 400 years in Egypt, but as the nation as a whole? But so do you suppose that there were those who only spoke Egyptian? I think so. Well, but think of it. We have this illustrated right here in our country, and particularly in Washington. In the past, I had the privilege of working with Laotians and with those from Vietnam and so forth, and we've had plenty of experience with Russian immigrants. And what really grieves them is that literally 2 generations later, their children would go to school and would learn English, and they could now speak Russian or Ukrainian, whatever they came with, Laotian, but they couldn't write it, and they could not read it all that well. And then when they got older and married, their kids, all they spoke was English in their house. And Grandpa is saying, I feel so bad that my grandkids can't understand me when I speak Russian. 2 generations. Well, the question is being asked, as slaves, did they ever even amalgamate, integrate into the Egyptian society? The answer has to be yes. I think if they were slaves, they were working all the time with Egyptians. They were getting orders in Egyptian. If they wanted to do any kind of trading back and forth, they had to do it in Egyptian. The truth of the matter is that you can study linguistics and you'll find that in a multilingual society, there's still a primary language, and that primary language will inevitably take precedence in terms of being one's first language. Yeah, they didn't start as slaves, you're right. They came in and got all the land of Goshen and just basically were doing great. Yeah. So all I'm pointing out is that, do we have to leave? Why doesn't he just do away with the Egyptians and let us stay here? So back to the point of leaven. Leaven is that symbol in this case of saying, Lord, whatever it costs, I want to follow you. Whatever it costs, I want to follow you. And he says, if you will say that to me, I will make your way prosperous. I will make your way straight. If you will follow me, I won't take you into terrible, 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 terrible times just for the fun of it. No. I will be your God and you will be my people. And there will be a great blessing in that. So, when you eat the bread of affliction, remember it's striped, it got beaten so that it wouldn't rise. It's pierced so it wouldn't rise, right? And then and we'll close with this, we'll carry on in the afternoon. And boy, do we have an afternoon ahead of us. Remember this, that it's far better to eat the bread of affliction, if you can call it that, to eat matzah, and be following the Lord, than to have the pleasures that you want and stay in Egypt. And frankly, in some ways, we're living in Egypt right now. Okay, can we be lights? Can we be testimonies? Yes, we can. That's what we're here for. We're here to sanctify His name. That is to let others know that He is the one and only true God. And to let that be seen and known in our lives. Okay. Let's finish and we'll continue on after lunch.